5, this spring's primary turned into this summer's primary due to the pandemic. But that wasn't the only factor that made this election one to remember. LEX 18's Claire Kopsky sat down with an election expert to recap the past few months in this Decision 2020 coverage.
The 2020 primary was marked by a few distinct images: masks at the polls, very few polls, a record number of absentee ballots, and a surprisingly close race, perhaps caused by societal events.
The pandemic shut down traditional campaigning. Rallies weren't really possible, parades where you shook hands weren't really possible, and that hindered candidates who liked to campaign that way. McGrath, when she ran for the House, did campaign very much in that fashion. The rise of Black Lives Matter protests, though, throughout the public health concerns, all of a sudden with these gatherings, large gatherings of people, and the setting was tailor-made for Booker. He could appear in front of it, he didn't have to gather the crowds, didn't have to rent a hall. The crowds were already there in the streets for him to address.
Even though the presidential seat was on the ticket, it was that Senate race that quickly became one to watch not just in the Commonwealth, but across the country.
The McGrath-Booker race gave us a chance to see how Kentucky Democrats would vote when given a choice between a sort of unashamed progressive Democrat versus someone trying more for the middle, trying to be more electable in the general election. And what we see is that the Kentucky Democrats are pretty split on that. About half seem to prefer a full-blooded progressive Democrat, and the other half seem to want somebody who's aiming for the center, that swing voter, so that they can take Mitch McConnell down.
Dr. Voss explained the Senate race wasn't the only factor that brought out voters. He said people are engaged in the political process, but often not because they're voting for the party they support, but rather against the party or the candidate that they despise.
The advocates of how Kentucky conducted the primary election, the people want to say it was a success, point to two things. One is that there were no major problems. That's true. The second is that we saw this huge increase in turnout. That's irrelevant. We were going to see an increase in turnout almost no matter what we did. Turnout has been increasing across the country for a couple of years now. We set records in the congressional elections of 2018. Turnout was really high in the worst administered elections this primary season, Wisconsin, Georgia. That high turnout was not because of the changes in election rules and the supposed making voting easier reforms that we engaged in. Turnout was higher because more people wanted to vote.
Now, due to the pandemic, the goal was to have as few people at voting precincts like here in Fayette County at Kroger Field as possible by making absentee voting and early voting widely available. Now, that idea backfired a little bit as Kentuckians repeatedly reported that they didn't receive their absentee ballots that they requested, or when they did send them in, the county clerk contacted them saying that there were certain issues. So some of those voters ended up showing up here to the polls anyway, or they decided at that point not to vote at all. Coming up in 30 minutes, we'll be discussing whether the shrinked number of voting precincts is a format that will be part of the plan for the fall in November's election. Claire, back to you.